What if I told you that the Viking Age, the raids, the ships, the conquests, would never have existed without the people history almost completely erased? The Viking Age evokes images of swords, shields, burning monasteries, and roaring longships slicing across cold seas. But the real story is quieter, stayed mostly inside longhouses, and was carried out by hands that rarely touched a weapon. Archaeology and texts from sources like Ibn Fadlan, sagas, and burial findings reveal an uncomfortable truth. Viking society didn't survive because of warriors. It survived because of the labor of women and children. This forgotten majority formed the economic core that made every expedition possible. Yet their contributions were so normalized in their own culture that medieval writers barely recorded them. Before Vikings became sailors, raiders, or kings, they were farmers. Up to 90% of the population lived in rural farming communities scattered across Scandinavia. These households were self-sufficient engines of survival. A Viking homestead was a production center. Every skill required for life: food processing, wool preparation, pottery, tool repair, leatherwork, rope making happened inside or directly around the longhouse. There were no global supply chains, no markets for everyday goods. Everything depended on the household. And within that household, women were the managers, producers, organizers, and economic strategists. The Norse word husfreyja, lady of the house, was not decorative. It carried legal authority. She could manage property, run farms in her husband's absence, and direct labor. Much of Viking expansion becomes clearer when viewed through this lens. If women and children could keep society functioning at home, men were free to sail farther from it. If you had to name the single invention that made the Viking Age possible, most people would answer without hesitation: the longship. Its sleek hull, its shallow draft, its ability to cross oceans and slip into rivers. But the ship alone was never enough. A longship without a sail was only a drifting shell. Oars could move it along coastlines, but they could not carry it across open seas. For that, the Vikings depended on something far less celebrated: textiles. The sail was the most valuable and labor-intensive object in Viking society. More expensive than weapons, more demanding than ships themselves, and it was produced almost entirely by women. Creating a single sail for a large longship required wool from hundreds of sheep. It demanded thousands of hours of spinning, thread by thread. It required 2 to 3 years of continuous, skilled weaving by one woman working full-time. The finished cloth then had to be waterproofed, using animal fat and fish oil, a process that had to be repeated again and again throughout the sail's life. This was not simple domestic work. It was industrial-scale production by pre-industrial standards. Modern experimental reconstructions by museums in Denmark and Norway confirm the scale of this labor. Without mastery of spinning, loom mechanics, fiber tension, and weather-resistant treatment, a sail would tear, soak, or fail at sea. And if the sail failed, the voyage ended. Every raid, every migration, every Atlantic crossing rested on this invisible technology. When Viking ships reached Iceland, Greenland, or distant shores of Europe, they arrived powered by years of female labor long finished before the journey began. So when we imagine the Vikings conquering horizons, we must ask a different question. If women wove the sails, then who truly wove the fate of the Viking world? In the modern world, childhood is imagined as a protected space, a time set apart from labor, danger, and responsibility. In the Viking Age, childhood was something very different. From an early age, Norse children were not observers of adult life. They were participants in it. Their survival depended on learning quickly, contributing early, and understanding the rhythms of work long before adulthood. Archaeology makes this impossible to ignore. Excavations at Borg in Lofoten and at Jorvik in York have uncovered tools scaled to children's hands, miniature looms, small knives, buckets, spindle whorls. These were not toys. They were training tools. Children learned by watching, then copying, then repeating. Skills were absorbed through daily exposure, not formal instruction. Work was learned inside the family, passed down through constant apprenticeship woven into everyday life. Girls were trained in textile production, food processing, herb knowledge, and animal care. They learned how to spin wool, preserve food, treat illness, and manage domestic resources. These skills were essential, not optional, and mistakes could mean hunger or death. Boys learned woodworking, rope making, boat repair, and the physical disciplines required for seafaring life. Those born into higher status families were introduced early to weapons, not as symbols of glory, but as tools of survival and social expectation. By their early teens, many boys were already sailing on coastal voyages. They hauled ropes, they rowed, they learned how to read shorelines and survive sudden storms. And some did more than sail. Some went raiding. In a world where danger was constant, Viking children were not shielded from reality. They were shaped by it. The true Viking battlefield was not across the sea, but on the land itself. Long before swords were raised on foreign shores, survival was fought every day on farms carved from cold, resistant ground. Scandinavia offered no easy harvests. Its growing seasons were short, its winters unforgiving, and a single failure could mean hunger or death. Life demanded relentless, coordinated labor. Fields had to be cleared of stone and forest. Barley and rye needed constant care within narrow windows of time. Hay had to be cut, dried, and stored to keep livestock alive through winter. Milk was turned into cheese, meat was cured, wood was chopped, water was hauled, again and again, without pause. Women stood at the center of this system. They coordinated the work, planned the seasons, managed food storage, and ensured nothing was wasted. Children carried out the daily tasks, learning responsibility through repetition and necessity. Men, meanwhile, were often absent, fishing distant waters, trading along foreign coasts, or leaving on seasonal raids that might last months, or never end at all. This is why Norse sagas repeatedly emphasize women as the stabilizing force of the household. Without them, the farm failed. Without the farm, the household collapsed. And without the household, no Viking raid could ever leave its harbor. This was the Viking world built in silence, and the one history almost forgot. Viking women were not simply weavers. They were technologists working with organic materials, mastering systems of production that demanded precision, experience, and deep environmental knowledge. Their work required the ability to grade wool by quality and fiber length, to control spindle speed for different thread strengths, and to operate complex warp-weighted looms where tension, weight, and rhythm determined the durability of the final cloth. They also understood waterproofing chemistry, treating sails with animal fat and fish oil to resist wind and seawater, and adjusting thread density to influence how a sail caught the wind. These were not domestic chores performed without thought. They were applied technologies, refined through generations of experimentation, failure, and adaptation to one of the harshest climates in Europe. These skills made the Viking world possible. They enabled transatlantic crossings to Iceland and Greenland, sustained long-range expeditions reaching the rivers of Eastern Europe and the markets of the Middle East, and supported the invasions and settlements of England and Francia. Every successful voyage rested on knowledge developed far from the sea. Children were integrated into this system from the beginning. They carded wool, scraped hides, collected herbs, carried water, and gathered firewood, learning each step through constant participation. It was not a collection of separate tasks, but a seamless economic ecosystem where every generation contributed to the survival and expansion of the Viking world. When Viking men left on raids or long-distance journeys, they did not leave behind empty homes. They left behind responsibility. For months, and sometimes for years, entire households operated without adult men, and in their absence, women assumed full authority over property, production, and social stability. They became the accountants of harvest storage, tracking supplies through long winters where miscalculation meant starvation. They protected land, livestock, and tools from theft or encroachment. They organized seasonal labor, coordinated with neighbors, and mediated disputes before they escalated into violence that could tear a community apart. They safeguarded children and elders, and preserved family honor in a world where reputation carried real economic and political weight. The Norse sagas reflect this reality clearly. In works such as Laxdæla saga and Egil's saga, women are not background figures. They make decisions that shape the fate of entire families and clans. Some controlled marriage alliances that redirected wealth and power. Some demanded vengeance when honor was violated. Others acted to prevent bloodshed, understanding the long-term cost of endless feuds. A few even led families to migrate when staying meant destruction. This was not passive influence. It was authority exercised at the household level, where survival, alliances, and continuity were decided. Through this quiet but constant power, Viking women shaped the social and political landscape of the Norse world, not from thrones or battlefields, but from the center of everyday life. For boys destined for life at sea or on the battlefield, preparation began long before adulthood. Strength, endurance, and discipline were shaped early, not through formal instruction, but through daily exposure to the demands of survival in a violent and unpredictable world. Training was gradual, constant, and woven into ordinary life. They learned how to handle an axe, not as a symbol of heroism, but as a practical tool that could shape wood, defend a household, or take a life if necessary. They practiced moving behind shields, understanding formation and collective defense rather than individual glory. Wrestling and strength conditioning built bodies capable of enduring cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Survival skills were essential. Boys learned how to endure winter, how to read the weather, and how to recognize when the land itself became dangerous. Rowing developed endurance and coordination, while navigation was taught through memory, stars, and the subtle contours of coastlines passed down through experience rather than maps. High-status boys often apprenticed under seasoned warriors or ship captains, absorbing knowledge through observation and imitation. Archaeological finds of weapon-bearing child graves suggest that these roles were not spontaneous choices. They were expectations formed early, shaped by family status and long-term planning. Viking children were not shielded from danger. They were prepared for it, trained to face uncertainty with skill rather than fear, and shaped into participants in a world where survival and expansion demanded readiness from the very beginning. The longhouse was more than a place of work or shelter. It was the emotional and cultural center of Viking life, a space where identity was formed and values were passed from one generation to the next. Within its walls, daily labor ended and memory began. Women shaped the inner world of the household. They preserved oral traditions, carried genealogical knowledge, guided ritual practices, and maintained healing arts through herbal medicine and experience. They were also responsible for household spiritual protection, blending belief, custom, and survival in ways rarely recorded but deeply felt. Children gathered around the central hearth, listening to stories of gods, monsters, heroes, and ancestors. These stories were not entertainment alone. Scholars believe they functioned as moral instruction, teaching courage in the face of danger, loyalty to kin, and resilience in a harsh world where loss was common and endurance was essential. Through these quiet moments, the Viking worldview was shaped. The longhouse created not only workers and warriors, but people who understood who they were and where they came from. In this way, the Viking Age was built not only by those who sailed outward into history, but also by those who stayed behind and raised the ones who would. In the sagas, a Viking raid appears sudden and dramatic, a burst of violence and glory that begins the moment a ship leaves the shore. But beneath that image lies a far more fragile reality. Economically, every raid was a calculated risk, balanced on years of preparation that rarely made it into the stories. For a single longship to sail, the community first needed years of wool production to create and maintain its sail. Farms had to produce enough surplus to feed families while adult men were absent. Children were required to step into labor roles normally filled by adults, keeping daily work from collapsing. Women maintained property, managed resources, and protected household stability throughout long periods of uncertainty. Tools had to be repaired, food had to be preserved, winter supplies had to be carefully rationed. Above all, the community needed social cohesion, strong enough to prevent disputes, theft, or breakdown while its labor force was divided. The raid itself was only the final moment in a long chain of domestic labor. It was the visible outcome of an invisible system. Without women and children sustaining the home front, no Viking ship would ever leave its harbor, and no raid would become legend. Modern historians increasingly argue that Viking expansion was not driven primarily by kings, warriors, or sudden bursts of violence. It was driven by systems, by households that produced surplus, by textile industries that sustained fleets, and by family structures stable enough to endure long absences and repeated loss. Norse society developed a highly efficient division of labor. Women held real authority within the household and possessed specialized skills that transformed raw materials into strategic resources. Children were integrated early into economic life, ensuring continuity of labor across generations. These elements combined to create resilience rather than dependence on individual leaders or moments of conquest. Compared to much of medieval Europe, Viking gender roles were unusually flexible. Authority was practical, not symbolic, and competence mattered more than status. This flexibility allowed communities to adapt quickly, replace lost labor, and sustain long-distance exploration, warfare, and settlement without collapsing at home. The Viking Age was possible because this society functioned like a self-replicating economic organism, capable of renewing itself even under constant strain. History remembers the warriors, but it was the women and children who built the world those warriors fought for. Everything we imagine when we hear the word Viking, the ships cutting through open seas, the sails filled with wind, the raids, the settlements, and the distant kingdoms, depended on people whose names rarely appear in sagas. Behind every voyage stood years of quiet labor, repetition, and endurance, carried out far from the horizon. The everyday hands of women sustained the household. They produced food, textiles, and stability in a world where failure meant collapse. The steady work of children replaced absent labor and ensured continuity from one generation to the next. Together, they formed the invisible power of the Viking household, the structure that made risk possible and survival sustainable. These were the true architects of the Viking Age, not the ones remembered in songs or carved into stone, but the ones who made expansion inevitable by keeping society intact at home. Their work did not seek glory. yet it created the conditions for it to exist. And now the question from the beginning finds its answer. The Viking world was not built only by the men who sailed across the seas. It was built by the society that stayed behind, endured the cost of absence, and made the sailing possible in the first place. If this story challenged how you imagine the Vikings, take a moment to reconsider what truly shapes civilizations, not just the warriors in front, but the unseen forces behind them. Subscribe to Primal Heritage to continue exploring the forgotten foundations of our ancestors, and maybe discover how much of them still lives within us today.